Hello, everybody. We're going to start. We have about a dozen people who are watching on Zoom. So again, good evening. My name is Bill Finger. I'm a co-chair of the Greenwich Affordable Housing Trust Board. And on behalf of the Trust Board, I want to welcome all of you and thank you very much for attending. And again, this presentation on affordable housing in Greenwich. And before we go any further, I want to introduce the members of our Trust Board. Starting on your right, Sally Bednar, Romulo Samaniego, Brooks Harris, who's our vice chair. Again, I'm Bill Finger, co-chair, Mary Jenkins, co-chair, Anthony Cicchetti, and Patrick LaRoe. So now I'll turn this over to Mary Jenkins, who will talk to you more about our presentation and kind of tee it up for the actual presentation itself.
Good evening, and again, thank you for attending on Zoom. I'm co-chair. I like to think of myself as junior co-chair. Bill is senior to me as co-chair. I'm also an alternate commissioner on the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I'm just going to set a few rules and ask your cooperation here in the room just to make things as smooth and easy as possible for everyone. And again, thank you for being here. As you learn, a developer comes to the trust looking for a loan. The trust examines the economies of the proposal. The developer benefits if the project qualifies as assisted housing under 830G. Now, for some of you, that last sentence probably means absolutely nothing, but that's why we're here tonight. By the end of the night, you will understand exactly what that sentence represents. And it's not on the exam, so don't worry. A developer that benefits from assisted housing gives us the opportunity at the trust to negotiate with that developer for either a reduction in the size of the project, the physical project, and or an increase in the number of affordable housing units in that project. So there's a benefit to the developer and there's a benefit to the town. The developer still has to go to planning and zoning to determine compliance with any applicable land use regulations. The commission does not discuss financing. So you can see that it's a bifurcated process, finances and regulation. Tonight is about the work of the trust. And so I'm going to set a few rules just to make it focus on the trust and stay there. We would ask that public comment specifically address the role of the trust in the development of affordable housing. And any other discussion be addressed directly to the Planning and Zoning Commission if it involves regulation rather than finance. I have to ask a particular sensitivity tonight to the Mason Street application, which was decided by the Commission on September 17th, 2024. That decision is subject to a statutory appeal process. So I'm asking that you do not ask questions or address that project for the mutual protection and benefit of the Commission and the applicant. Finally, during questions and answers, please address one of us and not your fellow audience members. That's to keep it an appropriate two-way conversation. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brooks Harris, who is the vice chair. Brooks has the unanimous approval of the Affordable Housing Trust Board for the content of tonight's presentation. But before I turn it over, I want to publicly express the board's thanks to Brooks for the amount of time and effort and patience that he has shown in creating tonight's presentation. So we thank you heartily, Brooks, for your work. Ladies and gentlemen, Brooks Harris.
Great, better turn that on. Great, thank you very much. Obviously this presentation was produced by the entire board, although I held the pen in my hand, so I must thank the board as well for all that. The only thing I want you to take away from page 1 is that little red comment at the bottom, and it reiterates what Mary says, that we are not the P&Z Commission. If you have questions that are relevant to them, that's not for tonight. And occasionally in the presentation, you'll see that red reappear. I'm not going to repeat this, but if you see that, just pretend I made that caveat again. That's the last time I'll say it this evening.
Should we wait till they pull it up?
Oh, till we wait till,
Not up on the.
oh, it's not up on the board yet. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, that's the one with red lettering at the bottom, and you might not be able to read it from the audience, but trust me, it basically says we're not the Planning and Zoning Commission. Please don't ask us inappropriate questions. And you'll see it occasionally from time to time. I'm not going to repeat that, even though I said I wasn't, and I just did. Okay, why don't we turn to page 2? And as many here know, because I see around the room several of the people who helped draft the legislation for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. This was created and approved by the RTM in 2021. It's really a tool we have for addressing a number of concerns relating to affordable housing. The primary objectives of the trust were stated to be addressing the need for more affordable housing in Greenwich, particularly workforce housing. So I think we all know that it's very hard for our teachers, our first responders, and other similar employees to find affordable housing in town. And it's also a tool we can use to negotiate with 830G developers to scale back the projects they propose. Now, I'll preview that we do not have the ability to prevent them from building anything they want to under 830G. All we can do is try and offer them some assistance that we'll describe in exchange for something that's more in line with town's needs. It won't be a perfect solution, but it'll be better than what the alternative is. And finally, I should say that this is set up to require very little town investment. So affordable housing development is extremely expensive, and I'll go into that in a bit, but we're not going to spend a lot of town money. This is a very economical way for us to do this. So with that as introduction, I want to play a quick video that the trust put together that gives a little background on ourselves.
Welcome to Greenwich. Our town is a magnificent place, but one that comes at a cost. It is prohibitively expensive for many of our working families.
When I grew up, a lot of the policemen and firemen and teachers lived in town.
They used to know everybody, and it was like, oh, the son of somebody, the father of somebody. You just had different kind of connections that you no longer have.
When you don't live in town, it makes it harder to have that vested interest. But this is the town I grew up in and the town that I still care about and want to keep giving back to.
By ensuring our first responders, service workers, and teachers are not priced out of a life here, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund was established to help develop housing that fits the needs of the town.
You want to make sure that people who live here, who want to raise a family here, can do so without expending, 75% of their income.
The more people that we can get moving into this town that can afford it will make this town a better place.
The trust is also the town's only tool to prevent large-scale development projects.
The Affordable Housing Trust is really the only tool that the town has to encourage developers of 8-30G projects to either build smaller buildings or to help us get to that 10% goal faster.
We urge you to consider a generous tax-deductible contribution, which will be matched by the town from our share of federal COVID relief stimulus funds and put directly towards paving the way for a better Greenwich for all. Thank you.
I'm going to interrupt Brooks for one moment. I neglected to also indicate that in addition to the trust board of 7 members, we have an advisory council comprised of up to 11 individuals from town. We have 2 openings, so right now our council is made up of 9 individuals. Several of them are here. I asked if they'd raise their hand, Lauren, Bob, and Ellen. Thank you. They provide valuable input and attend all of our meetings. Brooks?
Okay. Yeah, turn that on. If you turn to page 3, the first point we want to make tonight is that Greenwich actually does quite a bit to provide affordable housing for people. There are a number of sources, and people sometimes say, well, we're not doing anything. We actually have one of the highest percentages of affordable housing of any of the rural towns in Connecticut. We obviously can't compete with the urban towns. They've gotten tons of federal and state money to develop this housing, but relative to our peers, we're doing pretty well. And it really comes in a couple different forms. The first, as you probably know, is Greenwich Communities, which has developed a lot of units for a wide range of affordable housing clients. In addition, the RTM has mentioned in the Plan of Conservation and Development and subsequently passed a plan of affordable housing to provide guidelines for how we can move from where we are today to a future that includes more affordable housing. And then finally, the BET funded and the RTM approved the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. In addition, we actually have quite a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing, and none of that qualifies for the 10%. We'll talk about it because you need certain restrictions and documentation in order for it to count, but we do have quite a bit. And in addition to that, we have quite a bit of workforce housing. You probably know some of the schools have provided housing for people. So that's the point. We actually are doing quite a bit for affordable housing in town. If you turn to page 4, I'm going to talk for just a minute about 830G so we can all be on the same page. But the first thing I need to mention is that the right to control your planning and zoning comes from the state. The state has delegated that right to local planning and zoning commissions, but they can take it back whenever they want. They can pass any rule they want. And so some people say, well, why doesn't planning and zoning just address these issues? And it's important that you understand that 830G is the state basically taking back some of that local control. And basically what they say is there's 2 types of projects that qualify for exemption from local planning and zoning other than health issues. One is what you typically think of as 830G. It's called a set-aside development. If you set aside 30% of your units as affordable, and that means 80 and 60% of state median income, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, then your project is exempt from most of the local controls that would prevent larger developments. That's the first kind. That's what people normally think of. What we do at the Affordable Housing Trust is there's a second type of 830G development, and that's called assisted. If a local municipality or the state or the federal government invests in a project that has affordable housing, those affordable housing units qualify as affordable for purposes of 830G. So 2 things. One is they get to avoid local zoning, but 2, we can count those in our 10% number. And we'll talk about some other nuances around that. But suffice to say, that's at our discretion. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we will not approve any project that we think is not materially better than the alternative the developer could do without any assistance as a set-aside project. So that's kind of our absolute guideline. Okay. The 830G has become a more important issue recently because rents have gone up fairly dramatically, and so now it might be more economical for people to consider 830G projects. That having been said, we may see it decline somewhat because interest rates are up and the cost of building is up, so that's tended to offset these increased rents. So the spate of proposals we saw when rents spiked might not be as daunting as we thought at first. Okay, on page 5, we go through the volume we're talking about. So to date, in Greenwich, there's only 39 units that have qualified under 830G, okay? And that's of developments which have a total of 181 units. So most of the units are market, but there's 39 affordable under 830G. But the reason people are concerned is because pending are 7 projects that have 148 units, so it would dramatically increase our volume of 830G units. Most of those are the big 3 developments that have been proposed, Benedict Place, Greenwich Woods, and Mason Street. And so that obviously collects a lot of attention. People see large projects, a large increase in the number of affordable housing units, and they get concerned. And frankly, we're concerned, and that's why we invested our time to join the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and develop an alternative that we can kind of try and scale people back a bit. Okay, on page 6. So some people ask, well, why does every 830G project seem to be an outsized development? And the first thing I'll say is about half the projects are really smaller projects, like they might be 4 units instead of 3, which would be allowed by planning and zoning. But the ones that people are most concerned about are the outsized projects. And the reason that the projects are outsized is because to qualify as a set-aside, you need to have 30% of your units affordable, which means below market. And so you're losing money on each of those units. The only way to make it up is either to increase the price on the other units, and you really can't because those are market units. You're already charging market. The way developers do this is by building bigger units. And if you turn to page 7, I have an example. And what I want to say is, if you think about building a bigger building, there's certain fixed costs like the cost of land that don't go up as you add more units, and also there's economies of scale. And that's why the way developers offset their loss on affordable units, which are by rule priced below market, is to build bigger buildings and make up that lost profit on the extra units they include. And so in this example, a 30-unit market unit might cost $20 million to develop, but it's not linear. You might be able to develop 42 units for $25 million, and it turns out to be the case because the incremental cost of adding new units is lower than the average cost of building the original project. You can eventually catch up and make up for the loss you had on the affordable units. That's why these tend to be much bigger. Okay, on page 8, we talked about the different types of 830G projects. There's the set-aside projects, and there are the assisted projects. But a couple other nuances I wanted to mention about 830G, whether it's set-aside or assisted, the rules are challenging. In order to qualify for a unit, you don't have to live in Greenwich. You don't have to work in Greenwich. You don't have to have any connection to Greenwich. So people can be frustrated because it doesn't necessarily go to our teachers or, our first responders or people like that. And there's nothing that we or anybody can do. I shouldn't say anybody. Our state legislators can do something about that, but we can't do anything about that restriction at a local level. So that's one thing that we can't. But what we can do is when we invest in a project and convert it from a set-aside project to an assisted project, we can set our own standard of affordability. And that's super critical because the set-aside standard for affordability is based on state median income, which is very low relative to the median income in our local area. And as a result, very few people, first responders, teachers, municipal employees, can't qualify for this assisted housing because the income standard is way below what people in this area are making. When we get involved with an assisted project, we can develop our own standard of affordability, and we use a local area standard as opposed to a state area standard. And I'll show you the numbers in a second, but what it means is that a lot more of our workforce clientele can qualify for these units, which is basically one of our big goals. Okay, so if you turn to page 9, I've got some numbers here. So the state median income is $122,000, and to qualify for a set-aside project, you need half of the people need 60% of that as their income, and half need 80%, and that's for, say, a family of 4. That means that to qualify for affordable housing in a set-aside unit, half the people need to make less than $73,000 a year, and half the people need to make less than $98,000 a year. And what you can see is that a lot of our workforce employees are completely not able to qualify for this. So maybe the people that we most want to put in affordable housing can't qualify, and maybe I don't know who's going to get that housing. But when we go to an area median income standard, The area median income in this area, which is lower Fairfield County, it's a couple different towns, the area median income is $144,000, and our standard is 80% of area median income to qualify for affordability. And that greatly increases the ability of teachers and firefighters and first responders and other local employees to qualify. So we think that that's a major benefit. Okay, on page 10, we just have an example of kind of how this concept works. Let's say a market development is 30 units, and let's say that a developer comes with an 830G set-aside project. In order to make it economic, that developer decides that it's going to be 42 units with 13 affordable units included in that project. Obviously, that's going to add a story or two, and that's going to be, the most. There are many things that will be of concern to local residents, including density, but one of the biggest objections is going to be height. And by definition, the set-aside project is going to be well bigger. Now, I've given an example here where an assisted project we might get involved in would be smaller because the gap that they have to cover between the affordability standard of the state and the local area is smaller for an assisted project, and therefore they can make it smaller and still make it work. In this case, for example, instead of being a market development of 30 units or a set-aside development of 42, we'd be somewhere in between. So our assisted project might be 35 units with 7 affordable units. So you can see we're not going to be able to get back to, what it would have been had we had full control over our local planning and zoning, but it's also going to be materially better than what would have been the case on a set-aside, both because we can bring the size down, but also because we could make the affordability standard more in line with some of our local residents who may need that housing. Okay, on page 11, the first page that has the special red lettering that I'm not going to get into, we show a case study of 2 projects we got involved with. One was Mason Street, and in that project, the set-aside development was proposed as having 5 stories on the west side and 7 stories on the east side with 30% affordable housing. And that's bigger than would normally be allowed under planning and zoning, but we as a town don't have an ability to stop that. I mean, other than, we can raise objections for health and things like that, but eventually it's hard to stop an 830G set aside. But the assisted project that we otherwise would be able to negotiate with them, instead of being 5 stories and 6 stories, 5 stories and 7 stories, would be 5 stories and 6 stories, so that's smaller. And instead of having 30% affordable units, it'd have 40% affordable units. So, we'd obviously like to have full control over our own properties, and we'd like to be able to say, well, maybe it should be 4 stories and 4 stories, or whatever the local standard would be. We can't do that. What we try and do is we try and take a substantial portion of the economics that accrues to the different affordability standard, and we require them to apply that to lowering the size of the building. So they have to show us financials that show us that they're not making any more profit with the alternative structure than they would under the 830G structure. So we're not incenting them to build a project. They've got the same incentive as a set-aside project, but they're applying the benefits that we confer upon them to reduce the size or increase the percentage of affordability. So I just want to be clear, any project we invest in is going to be more in line with town standards than the comparable set-aside. We will not invest in a project unless we're convinced that what we're investing in is better than what they would do as a set-aside development. Okay, so everybody knows about the 10% list. That's called the appeals list, And if you have more than 10% of your housing stock as affordable, based on the definition of 830G, you are exempt. And so builders can't opt out of your local planning and zoning restrictions. Right now, we have 5.7% of our 25,680 housing units in town qualifying as affordable under 830G. 5.7% seems like it's a long way from 10%, and it is, but I should say only 28 municipalities in Connecticut qualify for this exempt list. There's 141 municipalities that don't qualify. And I'll go farther and say that in order to qualify, you almost have to be an urban municipality that's received a lot of money from the federal government or the state government or both to develop a special stock of affordable housing. If you're not there, there's very few towns that can qualify. So it seems a little bit, I don't want to say unfair, but maybe that's the word. It's a standard that's almost impossible for a rural municipality in Connecticut to hit. I shouldn't say almost impossible. It's very unusual. And by the way, of those 141 that don't qualify for exemption, we're pretty high on that list. Our 5.7% ranks pretty well relative to a lot of the other municipalities. Okay, so what would it take for us to get an exemption? It's a big question. Some people claim that you can never get, this is page 13. Some people claim you can never get an exemption because every time you build an affordable unit, you're increasing the denominator and you're just kind of chasing your tail. You'll never get there. And this is actually a very famous fallacy that was disproved in Greek times, and that's actually not true. And the way the math works is if you add one to the numerator, and one to the denominator, you will eventually get to 10%. I mean, and so I've done the math for you here. So 10% equals our current affordable housing stock, 1,472 units, plus X new units, divided by our total housing stock, which is 25,677 units, plus X units. We do a little quick calculus, and we solve that, and we figure out that X equals 1,217 units. So all we need is 1,217 affordable units, which, by the way, is a huge number, but it's not impossible. Okay. It may be impractical, but it's not impossible. If you turn to page 14, the other point I want to note is that calculation assumed all the units being added were affordable, and you get to 10% a lot faster if they're all affordable. If they're not all affordable, you're not getting to 10% very quickly at all. So what I show is on page 14, to get to 10%, if you assume 20 to 30% of your projects are affordable, so 2 to 3 affordable units, 7 to 8 market units, we would have to build between 5,500 and 11,000 new units in town. That's not going to happen. I mean, we'd have to redo our entire infrastructure. There's not enough land. So we are not going to get to 10% with projects that have materially less than 100% affordable housing. So, and that wasn't the charter of the Greenwich Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We weren't established with a goal of getting to 10%. We'd like to move towards it, but as you can see by the numbers, it's just not a practical vehicle for doing that. And indeed, even 1,217 100% affordable units is a daunting number. Greenwich Communities is the primary developer of affordable housing in town, and you only get credit for new units. So they've got a bunch of units they're renovating. They're already counting those. You won't get to count those twice. They are building new units, or they have proposals for new units, but even if they build 100% of what they proposed, we're nowhere near 10%. So I think it's really important for people to understand that unless we do something radical, it's going to be very difficult for us to get to 10%. And I frankly, it comments on the unfairness of this law that even if you try really, really hard and you make a valiant effort, it's a goal that's maybe unachievable. And the reason it's so challenging, if you turn to page 15, is because affordable housing is expensive to develop. So there's no substitute for it. If you want affordable housing, it costs a lot of money. What we do is what developers can do is if they offer a unit at below market, they have to make up that difference. And so the difference between a unit, an affordable unit and a market unit is about $250,000. So if you're a developer and you know you can only charge affordable rent, if I gave you a check for $250,000, you'd say that makes up for the future reduction in income stream I expect because it's affordable. So if you have a check for $250,000, you can create an affordable unit. But it's even more expensive if you just want to develop that unit and offer it out as part of a federal or state program. So for instance, Greenwich Communities might pay between $500,000 and $750,000 to develop one unit of affordable housing. Now, they are offering it at much lower affordability standards. So a lot of Greenwich housing, Greenwich Communities housing is for people who suffer from dramaticlessness. But nevertheless, that starts to give you an idea. And if we just take the number I threw out originally, which is the gap between market and affordable income, the present value of that $250,000, and you recognize that we need to develop 1,100 units, I mean, that's over $300 million is the kind of subsidy we would need to develop that kind of, and the state is not giving it to us, the federal government is not giving it to us, but money is what really drives the development of affordable housing, and it's expensive, and that target is very far away. So the second thing people ask about is a moratorium. Okay, we can't get to 10% very soon, and this is on page 16. So what about a moratorium? I mean, we heard New Canaan got a moratorium. And the way a moratorium works is if you're developing affordable housing at a fast pace, the state has a provision that allows you to be exempt from developers using 830G to circumvent your planning and zoning for 4 years. Okay, and the standard that you need is you need to develop 514 housing unit equivalents, which is political jargon. Basically, an affordable housing unit gets between 1 and 2.5 housing unit equivalent points, depending on how affordable it is. The more affordable it is, the cheaper the rent, the lower the rent, the more HUE points you get. Okay? Right now, Greenwich has fewer than 50 HUE points. We need 514. So we are so far away. But Greenwich Communities provides a lot of affordable housing that probably qualifies for HUE points. But they don't document what they would need to document for us to get the HUE points to qualify for a moratorium. We've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations based on their housing stock and assumptions about affordability, and if we were able to count all their housing stock in HUE points and all the projects they proposed renovating or developing, we might be close to a moratorium. I'm a little bit skeptical we get there. We still have more work to do. But if they don't qualify that housing for HUE points, we are not getting a moratorium anytime, not only anytime soon, I don't think we can ever get a moratorium. So that will be the key, whether Greenwich Communities can count or not. There's one other point I want to make about the moratorium, and it clarifies one of the misconceptions about the exempt list and 830G, and that is, in order to qualify for a moratorium, you can only count units that were built or renovated since 830G was passed back in 1990. And so some people conflate that with older projects not qualifying for the 10% list. So I'll try and say it pretty clearly. If your housing is affordable and qualifies under 830G, no matter when it was built, it counts for the 10%. If your housing qualifies as affordable under 830G and it was built before the law was passed in 1990, it doesn't count towards the moratorium. Okay, and so that's how that works. And so it's not the case that if we just do a closer inventory of our housing stock and find all the naturally occurring affordable housing, we'll qualify for the 10%. We won't. It is possibly the case if we qualify all the properties in Greenwich Community and all the things they plan to renovate and build, we could get close. Okay, You heard New Canaan got a moratorium, and on page 17, we talk about that. New Canaan recognizes that when a developer builds 9 units of market housing, that creates an obligation on the town to build 1 unit of affordable housing if we're to stay in line with our 10% goal. So in other words, the more units we develop, the more obligation we have to get to 10%. And New Canaan says to the developers, if you're putting this liability on us for affordable housing, we're going to charge you when you build these units. We're going to charge you something so that we can collect that money and invest it in affordable housing and not pay for the affordable housing out of the pockets of all the other residents of the town. And so that's what they did. They imposed this development fee on developers. They collected it up, and then when they had enough, they built a couple of 100% affordable new projects, and they did just enough that they were able to get a moratorium for 4 years. Now, they're a much smaller town than we are, so they only needed like 100 or 150 HUE points. So, we'd have more wood to chop, but, it's something that could be considered. Should we charge developers who build new units a fee because, we're accruing a larger and larger liability to create affordable housing, and, who's going to pay for that? Should it be the residents, or should it be the person who is expanding that liability? Okay, the final thing I'll say about the moratorium is only a temporary solution. So it'd be great to get a moratorium, and if we can get one, we certainly try, but it's only 4 years, and then you're right back to the same place you are. So you're constantly chasing that if you do get that. So, but if we can, we will. Okay, on page 18, we talk about funding for the Greenwich Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So as many people in this room know, because they drafted the original statute that created this fund, the original funding was intended to be through donations. I personally thought that donations in large quantities were unlikely, but I very much agreed with the idea of setting up a framework for giving us some leverage to deal with developers. And so that was the initial intention. Fortunately, the BET and the RTM allocated out of the ARPA funds about $650,000 for our use, and then they put another $450,000 aside to match dollar for dollar with donations. And the challenge there is the money has to be committed by 2024 and spent by the end of 2026. And if you've ever dealt with commercial construction, you probably realize, even though those dates might have sounded far away when we got the money a couple years ago, they're not really that far away. So it's possible that that commitment would need to be restructured, or the Affordable Housing Trust Fund would have to give that money back and wouldn't have money to operate with. Okay. On page 19, I want to emphasize that one of the elegances of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is that the cost of this does not fall too heavily on the town of Greenwich. As I mentioned, each affordable unit you want to construct requires a $250,000 subsidy, and if you were just building it to offer it out at a very low rent, you might pay between $500,000 and $750,000. That's a lot of money. The way this trust works is we lend developers units of $50,000. A medium-sized development gets $50,000 loan. A large development might get a $100,000 loan. And then that money gets paid back to us and we can use it again. But the main economics generated by the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is the right to redefine the standard of affordability from state median income to local, to area median income. And that difference could be $1,000 per month per apartment. So for instance, if you were to develop a project that had 13 affordable units, if you saved $1,000 a month per unit over the life of the project, which is 40 years, the value of that savings is over $3 million. And that's what the developer is going to return to us in terms of a reduction in size of their project. $3 million can buy a floor off your project. The $50,000 we lend them is kind of like pocket change. And so the big thing to emphasize here is that we're making a that green dot, you can hardly see it up there. We're making a very small investment in the project, but because we can convert it from set aside to assisted and change the affordability standard, the developer is seeing $3 million of value that they can return to us in terms of a smaller size development. And I'll also say, even aside from those economics, which is a very important driver, again, by going to the area median income standard, we're opening the possibility of teachers and first responders and other municipal employees and other workforce housing clients to be able to qualify to get into these projects. Okay, on page 20, kind of drawing everything together, in order to deal with the challenge from Hartford, which always wants us to do more, in terms of building more housing, in terms of investing more money, in terms of, I don't know, a little more blood, whatever. We have a strategy which I would refer to as almost all the above. So we find lots of different ways we're trying to deal with these issues. No one way deals with it perfectly. Even together, they probably don't get us all the way there, but it demonstrates that we're trying as a town to address this issue and hopefully takes some of the sharpness away that sometimes comes from Hartford that claims that we're not doing enough and they need more penalties or more strict restrictions, et cetera. So almost all the above. Greenwich Communities has provided a tremendous amount of affordable housing in town. The Affordable Housing Trust is another tool that we have in our pocket. We've talked about it a lot tonight. Inclusionary zoning hasn't really done too much for us yet, but basically there's zones where if you provide some affordable housing, you could get some compromise on some of your planning and zoning restrictions. Encouraging workforce housing, some of our institutions have been great at doing that, and we encourage that. And until we get a moratorium or qualify for an exemption, it's really important from a political point of view that we demonstrate effort in Hartford. Otherwise, there's a lot of different proposals that have been coming down the pike that would restrict our planning and zoning even more. And one of the ways we deflect that is by demonstrating effort to address this issue. And one of the things I like about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is it takes the smallest possible investment from the town. So we're not going to dump $300 million in to solve the problem that Hartford has created for us. We're going to invest a very modest amount and work around the edges. And I say almost all the above for strategies, because the one strategy that we don't implement is running the town down and watching our prices and our rents go through the floor. And so we're going to maintain the quality of our community, and that means that prices are going to be high and rents are going to be high, and we'll use the tools at our disposal to try and keep Hartford from doing too much to adversely affect the way we run things. Okay, with that, we're going to take questions and answers. If you have a comment, we will take that as a question and we'll answer that. So, and if you have a political commentary, I don't see any of our representatives here tonight, so maybe we'll avoid what we saw in our last presentation, which is a couple soapbox speeches, which we want to discourage. But if they're on the phone and want to make a statement, we will address that.
Brooks, I just want to, everybody online, we're going to do written question and answers. So we'll alternate between people in the audience and those. So if you want to write in, we can read that into the discussion and answer that or try to respond.
And for the people in the room, if you want to come up, you can come up to the podium and press the button that turns red, and you can, everybody on the phone can hear you as well.
Leslie Moriarty, I'm on the BET, but thank you for that. I thought it was a really well-done presentation, Brooks. And thank you all for your work. I just wanted to clarify and the benefits to the community for Greenwich Communities, for the Housing Trust, and all the tools that we have here, because the role that you're playing is different than Greenwich Communities. And so if the goal is just to work towards a moratorium, you can say, push all resources to Greenwich communities, and it builds up the affordable housing. But the one thing that you had talked about earlier, which I think should be highlighted, is that the contributions you're making to these local developers using 830G is making more palatable development projects for the community. We're not getting the density, we're not getting the height potentially in some of those, as well as creating more workforce housing because we're elevating the rents that they charge in those communities. And I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly and that those points are reinforced.
Thank you for that comment, and that is exactly what we were trying to emphasize tonight. I've had people come up to me and say, Brooks, you're not doing anything to the 10%. You'll never get there. And I say, we can't get, that's not our role. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to use the tool we have to make the projects more in line with the sensibilities of the town, to bend it from affordable housing that's outside the access of our regular workforce housing clientele, to make it more available to them, and to make the projects more in line with our local sensibilities. It's not a perfect tool, but it's one of many, and you expressed exactly what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Hi. First, I want to thank you guys for all what you do. This is a real challenge. What the town of Greenwich is really... So I'm Frederick Lee. I'm from District 1 on the RTM. I'm the chair, and I also served on the committee to form the Affordable Housing Trust with Brooks. Knowing how difficult it is for us to get to the 10%, much less even adding stock without disrupting the whole town, I just want to say I appreciate all the time you guys are doing, the challenges that you have to face. And I mean, this is like Brooks said, this is just one piece of the entire toolbox that hopefully we can develop even further. So I just want to say thank you. Thanks.
And we should say thank you to you as well, because you were one of the initial contributors that got this ball rolling. So we appreciate that.
Any questions online?
This might not be the right forum because I want to address it to P&Z, which is, has a P&Z considered the adding fees for developers to get more resources available towards the moratorium?
I mean, it's certainly a tool that we have. We've talked about it. A developer in town is suggesting it for another property. The pros is obviously money to go in to support other projects. The problem is that if you don't build it with the money that's being put out there for the development, then we have to find a place to do it. So it's a little bit of a delayed system, but it's certainly something that we have in our toolbook to possibly enhance the amount of money available for affordable housing projects.
The current project on the books is targeting those funds to the housing trust, but is there another? I mean, we as a community we've used Greenwich Communities to build affordable housing, but to get the money to Greenwich Communities, if that were determined to be the right place to go, is not through the trust, it's another vehicle.
Well, certainly the trust could give money to the housing authority. But they again, as we discussed, they get most of their funding from HUD and CHAFA, which is the state agency for those things. So they have a pipeline for resources that isn't available to the private developer, right? So it's as long as this is out there, it's not a promotion of housing trust activities. It's a promotion of private building. And that's really the downfall of the whole concept of 830G. It doesn't incentivize us to invest in the current infrastructure that we have to address affordability. It induces properties or towns that don't have a certain number to sort of subvert the regulations and create the opportunity, but the outcomes are not what it's not 100, it's not a 1-to-1, it's a 1-to-10 or 1-to-30.
And this is a much bigger question as well, because consider Greenwich Communities, despite its name, is not really controlled by Greenwich. So we don't have any oversight. And the board would seek to do what we thought was best for Greenwich with a lot of Greenwich control. The second thing I'd say is, I think our perspective would be more towards workforce housing that qualifies as affordable, whereas Greenwich Communities targets a much lower end of the spectrum. And so I think we can complement them. If we got a chunk of money, we have a lot of expertise on the board, and we would do it economically as well.
Is there anything precluding you from working together on projects that they develop?
We'd entertain any solution that is efficient and good for the town.
Okay, thanks.
And I'll just answer on behalf of planning and zoning. It's working, right? Planning and zoning is that there are incentives to include affordable housing in certain business districts. And part of the issue tends to be that we're working on revising that regulation because it hasn't been used as much as we had hoped it would be. And that would be giving developers in business zones incentives to have some softness on the size of a building if they are required to provide affordable housing in that building. So the tool is there. We need to sharpen it, and we are going to be sharpening it probably in the near future. So there are more than one ways to skin a cat. I hate to use that term. But, sorry, okay, animal lovers.
Yikes.
Animal lovers. But part of the problems with the fee as well is that a lot of public concern is once you increase any kind of zoning fee, any kind of additional cost to build, you're making it difficult for everyone to build more housing, whether it's available, affordable housing or a non-affordable housing. We have a tremendous housing shortage in the entire country of all kinds of housing. So the minute you start talking, oh, more fees, you get some pushback on that too. California tried it, not so much. So, we're trying every idea, we're trying every modification of what we already have. But fees are difficult because it can be an incentive and it can be a disincentive. So you have to find out where to fall in that.
I just add that under the existing ordinance that was passed by the RTM, if the trust board or the trust fund was ever fortunate enough to have $2 million in its coffers, there's a provision that we then would go out with essentially a public RFP to developers, whether they be Greenwich Communities, private developers who do affordable housing, not-for-profit developers that do affordable housing, because there are many nonprofit affordable housing developers or entities out there. There are for-profit private developers that do affordable housing. In fact, with the funds that Brooks referenced with New Canaan, with their funds that they have accumulated, there's a nonprofit that is building some affordable housing in that town. So again, if we were ever fortunate enough to have $2 million, I'm not asking the BET for that, at least publicly, no, but if we ever were fortunate enough to have that, and there was land available, either town-owned property or property that we could acquire with other funds, we would put out an RFP, and we could control exactly what could be built and would be built.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any questions online? Okay, I guess we covered quite a bit this evening. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Appreciate it. This will also be available online. We'll send a note around so people who didn't get a chance to come out tonight or listen on phone will get to. And we appreciate you listening in. And, we think this is something that will help do good things for the town of Greenwich.
And all of our meetings are noticed. They're open to the public. So far, I guess, except for this meeting and one other meeting, all our meetings are done virtually. So I welcome you to check the town's website, check the Affordable Housing Trust Fund's website for our agendas if you want to zoom in on one of our meetings.
Yes. Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.